Here's a good question. We recently had a PEP customer to pass away. At what point are the PEP family members are no longer considered a PEP?
Nikki, would you like me to take that one?
Yes, please, Hugo.
From experience, once the individual is no longer in the position that they were exposed to from a political point of view, there are clearly defined guidelines that can be followed. Now, if that individual is no longer alive, you are perfectly within your rights to say, well, their friends and family and close associates are no longer politically exposed. However, it could well be a situation that some of the influence that they may have been privy to still exists. So whilst you would be able to say, we're going to de-risk this individual, or we're going to downgrade them from being politically exposed to not being politically exposed, you do need to take into consideration that sometimes there can be a residual level of influence. So again, don't wish to appear to be sitting on the fence. In the first instance, you wouldn't necessarily define them as a PEP, but you would probably want to quantify that there is some level of exposure that potentially resides.
Okay, in the US, as described in the FFIEC manual, PEPs are defined as foreign individuals. Does this mean that US banks and fintech companies can consider domestic PEPs, example, mayors, congresspeople, etc., to be low risk, or ignore them completely?
One for you, Nikki, I think.
I mean, it would depend on what regulations you are adhering to. Congresspeople are going to be politically exposed persons. Mayors, it depends on, the size of or could depend on the size of the locale, how much influence they have, and whether or not from a risk-based approach you choose to categorize them as PEPs.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's one that, again, will vary from organisation to organisation from experience. Having worked for two large American banks, I can speak with a reasonable degree of knowledge and experience here. I think, again, it's about making a sensible assessment, and it's about having access to all of the information. And if you believe that the risk of ABC doesn't exist, then I would suggest that when you're making your risk-based approach, you have something that you can share with the regulator and explain to them why you either did or didn't perceive that individual to have political exposure, and therefore that they do or either don't present an ABC risk as you see fit. So I think that, if you're ever in doubt, that would be the argument that I would want to revert to think, yeah, I'm comfortable doing business with this for these reasons. And again, make sure it's documented.
Okay, continuing on. Another question. How can we identify close associates of PEPs without availability of any publicly available information, and if the customer does not disclose about, their close PEP friend?
Nikki, would you like to take that one?
Unfortunately, in this case, I believe you can't know what you don't know, right? And a risk-based approach is documenting how and what types of searches you'll do to find that type of information and determine, you've done enough to find if there's any family, close associates, etc. Once you've done that documentation, once you know that you've done all your proper searches and you've looked under all the rocks you know about, you can't know about what you don't know.
Yeah, I just add to that I think a large part of the dossier, if you will, that we need to establish on our clients should really be done at onboarding. So there is an element of education here to our front office colleagues where we need to be saying, these are the types of questions that you need to be asking. And again, I use the analogy of the relationship that you may have with an individual, and it could be a situation that you're speaking to a CEO of a bank who is involved in a debt capital markets transaction. You would have a very different perception of him if he were a PEP, if you were dealing with him as his private banker. So I think it's understanding that dynamic within the relationship as well. So I think it's critical to be able to make that determination.
Okay, I have a topical question here. Is there a worry that coming out of this COVID-19 pandemic that there will be pressure to accept business with rather looser controls?
Well, the one-word answer is yes. But I think a question deserves more than just that, because it's a good question. Yes is the answer, but I believe that it requires a little bit of explanation. I think from personal experience, again, 30 odd years, having been front office, middle office, I understand the pressures that we face on a daily basis. I understand shareholders, I understand concerns around profitability and so forth. But again, it's being able to make the right decisions. It's being able to understand who you're doing business with and why. And if in doubt, ask yourself that question, why me, why now? Why does this person want to do business with me, and why do they want to do it now? And if you can answer both of those questions with a reasonable degree of comfort, then go ahead. But make sure that you've understood where the potential risks are. But yes, I think fundamentally we need to be on our guard, because we've seen where standards have slipped, and we've seen what's happened. You know, that there are some very, very well-known, prestigious names that have suffered some very, very significant fines because they weren't as choosy as they should have been with who they were doing business with. Nikki, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add on that one.
No, I don't have any commentary on that one, Hugo.
Okay.
Okay. How often does the official PEP list get updated?
That's a very good question, because there are a number of different official PEP lists. From my experience of primarily working in the European Union, we would tend to review that on a daily basis to make sure that there are changes, or that there aren't any changes, obviously. And again, we'd want to understand if any positions have been added, and equally if there have been any changes, you know, elections, by-elections and these sorts of things, or if people have resigned and been replaced. So from our perspective, from an RDC point of view, and I'm sure Nikki can provide a bit more colour, we would look at this on a regular, normally a daily basis.
Certainly, when we talk about official PEP lists, right, there's different ways that official PEP lists can be approached. From a country perspective, how often they're updated, if a country chooses to publish official PEPs, as some have, it's up to the country to determine how often those need to be updated. And in some cases, when we talk about official PEP lists, it's simply a list of positions that a country might consider to be PEPs instead of actual names of PEPs themselves.
I think that's a great example. And again, I'd revert back to the point in case where we looked at the Swiss regulation. That's obviously a fairly major change, but there will obviously be more subtle ones that we need to keep abreast of as well.
Okay. Would you please throw some light on NIO?
NIO is just short for non-infrastructure official. So that is a high-ranking official in a department such as the Department of Education, right? We think about how all of our countries are kind of shut down right now in the COVID-19. So what are considered essential businesses and what businesses are still operating at a government level? NIO would be probably any type of business that's shut down right now.
Okay, and this may have been addressed before, but why is Swiss Postal Service a risk?
They're state-owned.
Easy enough.
I mean, I could
I feel
give you
a bit stupid for asking, yeah, actually.
So yeah, I mean, effectively, the approach that we have taken from an RDC angle is that we would be more conservative than our most conservative customers. So again, we will facilitate information that enables our clients to make the best decision possible. And they may say, actually, do you know what? Not a problem. And we're like, well, that's fine. You tell us what you want to know and we'll tell you. But again, it's not necessarily our position to say we're judge, jury and executioner, but we will say, you know, we'll give you the information so that you can make an educated decision based on the facts at hand.
And, you know, by most regulations, it's not actually the Swiss Post Office itself that is considered a PEP. It's not a person, it's an organization. It's the high-ranking officials in that organization that would be considered PEPs and potentially exposed. And again, similar to the international sporting officials, they could have, you know, they could be making decisions on government contracts and other critical pieces of information like that where government money is spent, and they could be doing that for their own personal gain.
Yeah. Really important to add as well that they could potentially be responsible for appointing new directors, and equally it's conceivable that they could have recourse to public funds. So again, it's understanding, you know, the level of materiality, if you will, not only of that individual, but obviously of the position that they hold. And it could well be a situation that you would have a very different view if that individual were, let's say, a non-executive director versus the chief executive officer. And okay, I've used sort of a polar example there, because obviously the majority of the people will probably be, from a risk perspective, somewhere in the middle. But again, it's important to understand and make that determination and that differentiation as well.
What's the current regulatory expectation on classifying a PEP as once a PEP, always a PEP, or has there been a shift in that expectation with more institutional specific discretion?
Great question, and I'm very glad somebody raised it. I would say that this differs from organisation to organisation, but most of the places that I've worked in do a take approach that says, yeah, once a PEP, always a PEP. And personally, I agree with that. However, as I mentioned before, if you have an individual that is deemed to be politically exposed, however, they aren't necessarily material, that is a judgment. That is a decision that an organisation or an individual within that organisation has made. So from my point of view, if somebody were to say to me, well, this individual is no longer in the position that forced them to be politically exposed, they've been out of that position for greater than 12 months, and if I'm being asked to make a decision, do I support the decision to de-risk that individual and say they're no longer a PEP? If my policies and procedures in that organisation allow me to do that, then yes, I would do that. I would want to raise a degree of caution, and I probably wouldn't want to de-rank that individual from high risk down to low. Probably choosing a medium risk rating would be slightly more appropriate. But again, I think you'd look at the facts that you have at hand. Again, has there been any events? You know, is there any adverse media? Do they have any other affiliations or exposure that we'd need to be aware of to determine that level of risk, specifically around ABC?
Okay, I've seen several attendees today asked for a more in-depth discussion of event risk.
Would you like to take that, Nikki, or shall I?
You can take it, Hugo.
Okay, thanks. So event risk will normally be one of several factors, and it could be an amalgamation of those. That the sort of areas that we would focus on in this particular bracket would be items of adverse media. And as Nikki kindly indicated earlier on, you know, there are a number of different PEP determinations that we have. We have a number of different risk codes as well. So any one of a number of different factors could be taken into consideration. Some maybe more reputational, some more financial. But we're looking at items of adverse media. We're looking at whether or not an individual is subject or formally the subject of sanctions. And again, obviously, we're looking at their level of political exposure. So again, we would rate the country risk, but we would also take into consideration the position. And again, you can't really view those items in isolation. You need to look at them in totality. So certainly understanding an event code for somebody that is effectively a low-level PEP that you may deem to be immaterial, if they are the subject of adverse media or are a known associate of somebody who is sanctioned, you'd probably want to factor that into the overall risk rating. Equally, if you have somebody who is a very high-ranking official in a potentially less acceptable jurisdiction that has no adverse media, you may think, well, there is no event code yet, but you know the likelihood or the possibility of that happening is obviously elevated. So I think from that point of view, again, you need to look at things in totality rather than in isolation.